Thanks, Minister. So at 11:59 p.m. last night, lockdown was lifted across Victoria. As I said yesterday, the commitment of every Victorian to staying home and staying safe helped us get to that position, as did the 40,000 primary close contacts and their household members who joined them in 14 days of quarantine. As a reminder for everyone about the changed settings, so there are no restrictions on the reasons to leave home, but staying COVID safe remains very important. There are no restrictions on travelling across the state, but if you're travelling interstate, be aware of two things. Other states are likely to have their own controls on entry while we're emerging from our outbreak, so look for updates across any jurisdiction you might be travelling to, and you'll need a permit to return. And then New South Wales as an extreme risk zone means that if you don't live in the border bubble, you won't have an automatic entitlement to return to Victoria if you travel into these areas without an exemption, exception, or unless you're a specialised worker and have a permit. So don't travel to an extreme risk zone and don't travel to a red zone. Face masks remain mandatory indoors and out. You do not need to wear a mask in your own home or if a lawful exception applies. Private gatherings in the home are not at this stage permitted. Household settings are where we know coronavirus spreads the most. There was a recent household gathering in Pendle Hill in New South Wales where dozens of people have become cases. There are many more examples of that across the world, and we can't risk that happening here. If you want to see friends and family, you can, but please do so outdoors in a public space, in a group of up to 10 people, or join them at a venue that can operate like a restaurant or a cafe. If you can work or study from home or another suitable premises, you can go to work. Offices can increase in attendance up to 25% capacity or 10 people, whichever is greater, and schools and early childhood care are open. Critically, if you're required to wear a mask at school, you really must. If you're going to the snow this weekend, you should start thinking about when and where you'll get that test, because you need a negative test for everyone in your household who's 12 and over. That may mean getting a test close to home where it's easy and you won't have a wait time, rather than close to the mountain that might be under more pressure. So you've got that 72-hour period before you go up to the mountain to get that test. So look to get one here in Metro Melbourne if you're coming from Melbourne. Testing turnaround times are really good. 99% of tests yesterday were returned by the next day. So you're very, very likely to get that negative result in good time. But stay on the safe side and prepare for it to take a bit longer just in case. I am really pleased that we've been able to lift lockdown, obviously, and lift it on schedule. But in the last few days, we've seen 8 to 12 cases a day. All of those linked cases have been in isolation, but that doesn't mean the environment we're in is risk-free, as this morning's case illustrates. So we are relying on all Victorians to continue to follow the rules, to wear their masks and to observe all the gathering limits and other restrictions. And of course, we're relying on them to check in, to get tested, and if eligible, of course, to get vaccinated at the earliest opportunity. Thank you. Kate Matson. Oh, it's obviously a concern, but we are in early minutes, if not hours, of understanding exactly what's happened, where it might have been acquired at a testing site. Obviously, that's a point we'll look at in terms of how he might have acquired it, but we have to go through that process of interviewing, understand where he's been whilst potentially infectious, and then really work out what the links might be.
What's the testing regime for people who work at testing sites? Are they required to test regularly?
Oh, they'd be required to test whenever symptomatic, but there's no surveillance testing that I'm aware of. But the vaccination's also offered to all of those staff. No, early days. We haven't got the interview completed yet.
Do we know what else?
Do you know exactly how many people are in isolation, how many staff?
No, it'll be everyone who worked on either of those two shifts with him. So there'll be a couple of dozen at least, I think. So it's the Moonee Valley testing site. Yes.
And what's your initial advice to people
who went and got tested at that site for those 2 days?
Well, obviously, as we would say for every Victorian, if you're symptomatic, please go and get tested, isolate until you get a negative result. But as the Minister said, the risk to individuals coming through in their cars is extremely low, really. But if you've wound down your window to speak to a traffic controller at that site, that might put you at a slightly greater risk. So I think it's more about where he's acquired it from rather than the risk to those coming through, because most people would drive through without winding their window down until they're getting tested. But for everyone who's symptomatic, obviously just to isolate and get tested and await a result.
Do we know what LGA he's from?
No.
Are we assuming he bought it from somebody who went through the testing?
No, we make no assumptions whatsoever. Obviously, we'll look through to see whether anyone who's subsequently tested positive has gone through that testing site, but we have to do all of the investigations as to where he might have acquired it.
And what are the PPE requirements for traffic controllers?
So there's a tier 2 PPE, a mask like you're wearing, Nick. So it'll be standard for those non-direct interactions. All other testing staff wear a higher tier of PPE, but
He's basically just worn a mask.
he's worn a mask, yes.
Are you expect to change your surveillance testing recommendation going forward? Should they be tested like?
Oh, we'd review everything about this, but again, very early days in terms of understanding exactly what's happened. But as for any critical incident, if you like, we would go through a rigorous process of understanding what's happened and what it might inform.
We've had days of cases majority in isolation, so how does this now change things moving forward?
Well, as I say, we just need to see what has occurred here. Overwhelmingly, we've had people in isolation the last 3 days in full before this case. That's all terrific news. But, as we said yesterday, it's not over. There will be ongoing risks and there'll be ongoing potential for incursion into Victoria. So it is not like any of us need to let our guard down with respect to all of the things that we know we need to do.
Just on rapid antigen tests, that's something that New South Wales is looking at introducing. I understand they have more efficacy in situations where you've got large numbers of cases, but is it something that Victoria is looking at? Is that something we could do in the future?
Yeah, we've looked at it right through. Again, very context specific. If you've got low or no coronavirus cases and you're doing 100,000 rapid antigen tests, you'll probably ping a few positives and they'll all be false positives because you've got no coronavirus. If you've got 100,000 people and a good number of them, tens or more, have COVID and you use that rapid antigen test, you'll pick up, maybe the majority of them. But you'll miss some, and you need to be in a situation where the benefit of getting that result, within 10 or 20 minutes outweighs missing those few. You don't want false reassurance. You still direct people to get PCR testing. And when you've got a PCR system like we have in Victoria with results, most of them the same day, many within 8 hours, you have to look at what the advantages might be. But with a higher load of coronavirus, with the potential for essential workers or others to be screened at a kind of point of entry, then it might come into play. So we're looking at it. There are some research projects that we've done, and we continue to keep an open mind about them.
And have you got an update on vaccination rates for the 199 odd cases we've had in the last 2 community outbreaks?
We can come back to you with that. Look, in general, the vaccination rates for our cases has been lower than you would expect for the equivalent age groups. That might relate to the demographic of people who are passing on infection, but it might also be that the effect of one or more vaccines in protecting people. So it does in general have a look about it that people who've had at least one vaccine are not so represented in our case numbers. That's a good sign.
Given your thought in the last community sport that is, how soon do you think it can be for people to have people in their homes? Some people say people tackling each other with phones on around. Are you comfortable with that position?
So we'll review, as we've said all along, on a day-by-day basis, but at the moment these settings are for a couple of weeks. We're not saying that you can't see loved ones or family, but we are saying please see them outdoors because indoors is that risk setting, and when you multiply it by a couple of million homes across Victoria, that's a substantial risk increase to have that allowance at this point in time.
Sport where there's no mask.
Yeah, sport is not 2 million households. Sport will happen with hundreds of people, understand that, but it is outdoors by and large, and it doesn't have that multiplier effect of many millions of people coming together.
Just on that, why is there such a disparity in numbers on that? I mean, last time we were able to have a couple of people in the home. Why is it now no visitors in the home and you've really opened up for hospitality and other sectors?
Look, it really is where we see transmission occurring, and obviously with the outbreak that we've just had, we saw it in sporting arenas, restaurants and some workplaces and schools. But that was really an indication of how it was introduced in those settings. If it had been let run, all of the further transmission would have occurred in households. We've stopped that transmission in households by identifying quarantining people very early on. We're now seeing the transmission in households for primary and secondary close contacts because people are deciding to quarantine with family or have to quarantine with their household members. It's a super risk setting for those individuals who are positive to pass on to others in the house.
Brenda, is inter-school sport able to go ahead?
No, not at this stage. So it's community sport.
Why is that?
Well, look, it does mean that you've got events occurring across the state, potentially. We are opening up to community sport with pretty generous numbers because that's a way to contain it and to review and move stepwise. We are not opening to the kind of events in the same way that we haven't got large sporting events occurring.
But these are schools that are obviously already operating.
Yep.
They can't operate like a community sporting match.
So school sport can occur, but it's got to fall within the community sport settings.
Right. So like a carnival or like a major event can't go ahead.
No.
A school can verse another school in football.
Look, I can come back to you with the legal wording of our directions with respect to that.
Are there current rules for people that live,
I'll come to you shortly.
that live alone? Like it's not an intimate partner situation, but if you live solo, can you still have one person around and get a bubble situation? Is that
You
not-
can. No, you can have a single social bubble. Yeah. Sorry.
Music teachers can bring students to their homes.
I'll come back to you on that one as well.
And
How long was the infectious period for this latest case, and are you expecting many exposure sites?
So we really don't know. We have to go through the interview with him. But he's obviously tested very quickly after becoming symptomatic, and we've got the result straight afterwards. So there should only be that day of having symptoms and the 2 days prior that we always include as potentially infectious periods. So there's 3 days to investigate for how he's been out and about.
What's their age profile?
I don't have that information, sorry.
He does.
Sorry?
It's a man.
Yes. A young man, I believe.
What are your thoughts on the idea of giving more allowances in terms of what you can do and restrictions for people who are vaccinated, whether it's now or in the kind of short term before we get that widespread vaccination?
Look, I guess I've been asked this question many times. I keep saying the same thing, and I do accept that you're at lower risk as a fully vaccinated individual in particular. I think that should mean that there's consideration of either greater movements or greater involvement in certain things, whether they're events or certain settings. I'm very strongly in favour of there being a national standard for that, so that there isn't an ongoing and highly charged debate around the disparity between jurisdictions or without there being some kind of national standard setting in that regard, including how you validate it, what is regarded as fully vaccinated, which vaccines it might apply to, whether people who've been vaccinated overseas but finished their course here might be included, whether it applies to all of those intervals between first and second dose, and so on and so forth. They're really critical things from the point of view of equity and natural justice for people who are included in freer movement or freer involvement in events. So yes, I think the principle sounds pretty good, but there is a real need to make sure that we've got a kind of consistency of approaches across the country.
Is there a role for AHPPC in working on what those national standards should be and then maybe making those recommendations to National Cabinet and the Federal Government?
Yeah, I think so. We haven't had that request from National Cabinet. It would be a combination of my colleagues and myself through HPPC, but also ATAGI as an immunisation expert group around what it means to be fully vaccinated.
Do you think it would be fairly done before vaccinations are opened up to everybody? Like, for example, if you did it now, somebody could have more freedoms by virtue of the fact they're 40 and over, whereas people who are in their 20s and 30s can't go and get the recommended vaccine.
Yeah, I think it brings in some of those issues of inequity. If there's an entire large age cohort who haven't yet had an opportunity to be vaccinated, it becomes a tricky thing to say that others who've had that opportunity have got entitlements to be in certain settings or events or have movements. So that's a tricky consideration.
The Victorian Transport Association and a lot of people in the border towns are concerned about the number of truckies that are coming into the state without either being checked or without having a permit. Is there any plan to tighten up further, particularly obviously given the history?
I'll throw the Minister because I know he's across this, but my understanding is there aren't huge gaps in that space.
Thanks, Nick. So we saw that.